Good evening. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to Universidad del Pacífico. This evening, we will award Dr. Lars Peter Hansen with the title of Honorary Professor of our university. To begin with this ceremony, I would like to invite Professor Diego Winkelried, Head of the Academic Department of Finance of Universidad del Pacífico, to present us with Dr. Hansen's academic sketch. Professor Winkelried, please.
Dr. Elsa del Castillo, President of Universidad del Pacífico, Professor Lars Peter Hansen, faculty members, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the work and outstanding contributions to economics and statistics of Professor Hansen, who is receiving the degree of Honorary Professor in Economics from this university. I'm privileged to introduce him, even though he does not need an introduction. Professor Hansen is the David Rockefeller Distinguished Service Professor in Economics and Statistics and the College of the University of Chicago, and the founding director of the Becker-Friedman Institute for Research in Economics, also at the University of Chicago. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Finance Association, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and former president of the Econometric Society. Professor Hansen has been the advisor of about 60 PhD students, many of whom are nowadays prominent economists holding important positions at top universities and economics institutions around the globe. Professor Hansen is perhaps best known for his fundamental advances in econometric theory. In his early 30s, in a series of path-breaking papers, he introduced and developed the so-called generalized method of moments, or simply GMM estimation framework. It is often hard to grasp and appreciate the full extent of this contribution without resorting to technicalities. And I hope Professor Hansen forgives me if he finds the following analogy simplistic or inaccurate. Picture yourself in the early 90s listening to your favorite song. Even though you may be only interested in that particular song, chances are that the only available way to fully enjoy it is by buying the $20 complete CD. Enter MP3 audio technology, which eventually allows you just to buy a $1 compressed version of your favorite song without the need to care or paying for the rest of the CD. This is the essence of GMM theory. Simply focus on and enjoy the song that you regard worth listening to. Purists may tell you that the quality of the CD version is much higher, but in reality, the differences with your MP3 file are inaudible. For all what matters, the MP3 version is equivalent to the full CD counterpart. Just as the MP3 technology, GMM was an instant success, granting Professor Hansen the 1984 Fritsch Medal of the Econometric Society, which is regarded as the most prestigious Best Article Awards in economics. This is one of a long list of renowned recognitions Professor Hansen has received for his work, which includes the 2006 Nemmer Prize in Economics, and of course, the 2013 Nobel Prize in Economics. The elegant GMM framework proved to be so comprehensive and versatile that even though it was originally motivated to address empirically rational expectation models and asset pricing models, it quickly found its way to a broad range of statistical applications, well beyond macroeconomics and finance. For those of us who are passionate about econometrics and learned it in the post-GMM era, Professor Hansen is one of the greatest minds the profession has produced. GMM theory is just the earliest outcome of Professor Hansen's philosophy of doing something without having to do everything. And it allows researchers to focus on partially specified economic models. Partially specified models are likely to be altogether misspecified, and Professor Hansen's most recent contributions, also within the boundaries of macroeconomics, finance, and statistics, is to give empirical credibility to the estimation and testing of such misspecified models, mainly by understanding how economic agents and policymakers cope with risky and ambiguous environments. His lecture tonight, Confronting Uncertainty in a Changing Environment, is on this fascinating topic. Professor Hansen, I hope you're enjoying your visit to Peru. It is truly an honor to welcome you as part of Universidad Pacífico family. Thank you.
We will now bestow the Medal of Honorary Professor upon Professor Hansen. For that reason, I would like to invite our president, Dr. Elsa del Castillo, and Professor Hansen to the stage, please. El Consejo Universitario de la Universidad del Pacífico, considerando que el señor Dr. Lars Peter Hansen, por su aporte al desarrollo de métodos estadísticos utilizados en la investigación empírica de la economía financiera, se ha hecho acreedor del aprecio institucional, de conformidad con las disposiciones legales y reglamentarias vigentes, acuerda otorgar a su favor el nombramiento de profesor honorario como distinción especial, por lo cual le extiende el presente diploma para que se le tenga y reconozca como tal. Lima, 3 de septiembre de 2015. Congratulations. I am now pleased to invite Dr. Hansen to present the conference, Confronting Uncertainty in a Changing Economic Environment.
So, thank you. I'm really honored to be invited to visit and to become affiliated with this exceptional university, its faculty, and its students. Today I'm going to talk about topics that are important to me, namely the impact of uncertainty on economic analysis. My research has been aided by prior work in mathematics, in statistics, and finance, along with economics. And I find that building bridges between fields fosters intellectual advances. While uncertainty is pervasive in our lives, in many discussions of economic analysis and policy, it takes a back seat. I will discuss ways and reasons that we should instead push uncertainty to the forefront of our thinking. As an economist, I build mathematical models. Why? To represent clearly our understanding of the economy, to predict what happens when the economic environment is altered, such as changes in government policies, tax policies, exchange rate policies, monetary policies, and the like. The models that fascinate me are ones that are ambitious enough to confront macroeconomic questions and rich enough to feature a role for financial markets. Uncertainty is central to the models and how they're used. Capturing uncertainty in a formal way is essential for this endeavor. The models are dynamic. They capture the evolution over time that must be revealed through the use of data. The models introduce random impulses or shocks that are transmitted through the economy over time. But randomness is only one aspect of uncertainty. Another attribute is that we really need to use data to figure out what goes, in order to figure out how to calibrate or estimate the models. Part of economics as a scientific discipline is the willingness to measure and acknowledge the uncertainty in our answers to important questions. Models are not exact replications of reality. They're simplifications, and hence not perfect. Rather than dismiss imperfect models, and trust me, economic models are imperfect, I prefer to use them in sensible ways. The nature of these imperfections contributes to uncertainty broadly conceived. Given my experience as an economist, I'm convinced that the importance of uncertainty is a central ingredient in building and assessing models based on empirical evidence. As I will explain, there's several dimensions to this discussion that are pertinent to how we build and use models. I'm sure you've all felt anxious with unexpected economic crises and downturns. The models that I work with aim to incorporate this type of investor or individual anxiety and reluctance to go forward with new ventures in very uncertain times. They provide a more feasible and sober framework for assessing economic policies. So the strategy for my talk today is to explore some revealing intellectual history, showing how our thinking about uncertainty has evolved over time. And I'll draw on insights in discussing why uncertainty should be a critical ingredient to economic analyses. Well, I do not expect you to become expert economists in one lesson. I certainly hope you'll leave this talk with a different perspective on the importance of uncertainty. So let me start with the following rather unusual picture. In fact, it's actually two pictures. If we think about probability theory in advance of Jacob Bernoulli, who was writing over 300 years ago, it was all about games of chance. Games of chance are where we like flip coins and there's a 50-50 probability heads or tails, or more complicated rolling of the dice, rolling of multiple dice. The probabilities are known, but not the outcomes. Jacob Bernoulli wanted to use probability models to think about social scientific data. And so he realized this was a situation that's different than games of chance. He invented or came up with the law of large numbers, and this was a characterization about how unknown probabilities are revealed and how quickly they can be revealed. Think about an urn. Suppose it's got like red balls and yellow balls, and you don't know how many of each type there are in that urn. You get repeated draws from that urn of red balls or yellow balls. You can keep track of them. As you get more and more data, you'll eventually figure out what goes on. Roughly speaking, this is the kind of how the role of statistics in the analysis of economic and other data. I think of this Jacob Bernoulli perspective, the perspective of the individual on the left-hand side of the picture here, as that of capturing a form of uncertainty that's outside an economic model. Econometricians or statisticians are given a model, and they need to figure out, estimate unknown parameters, test it, and the like. But how about on the right-hand side? The right-hand side is a painting by Pizarro. And it's a painting of a marketplace. When people come to the markets, they don't really know how much demand there'll be for their goods. They don't know what prices will clear the markets. They also face uncertainty. I think of this as inside uncertainty, and when economists build models, they have to also capture how individuals inside their models confront uncertainty. So this leads me to draw this distinction of uncertainty in economic analysis. One is the more statistician's perspective that's captured by Jacob Bernoulli. Given a dynamic economic model, researchers, they estimate unknown parameters, they estimate model implications. However, when we build the model, the researchers have to depict economic actors, consumers, enterprises, as they cope with uncertainty, and deduce the consequences for market outcomes and resource allocations. Uncertainty then shows up in these two different ways: outside a model and inside a model. So let me start with the field that's of considerable interest to me is economic time series, and kind of give a crash course in the history of this field. It's a truly fascinating history. I would love to be able to talk about it for long points of time, but let me go to the person on the left, Bachelet. 1900s, he's writing the original models, probabilistic models of financial markets. He's doing this as a mathematician, writing his dissertation on this subject. Bachelet is one of the co-inventors of something that's now called Brownian motion, and he saw these kind of so-called Brownian motion, these situations where you have these random shocks that kind of hit a dynamic system as a useful framework for what financial markets do and how they kind of share risk and the like. Bachelet's work by economists was not recognized for 50 years. Paul Samuelson, 50 years later, picks up on Bachelet's work and develops the theoretical underpinnings of the so-called efficient markets hypothesis of finance, subsequently tested prominently by my colleague Gene Fama and many others. So now, a little bit later, after Bachelet, are some other important contributions. Ewell, okay? So Ewell is a statistician, arguably, according to Stephen Stigler, my colleague and expert in the history of statistics, kind of the initiator of modern time series statistics. Ewell was not an economist. Ewell was studying sunspots, okay? And he wanted to build a model of sunspots. Sunspots have a roughly cyclical behavior, between 8 or 9 years, I believe, but not exactly. It's not an exact cycle as you would see in sine and cosine waves and the like. It was only approximate. So Yule comes up with this model where there's these random shocks that hit every period, but they get transmitted in cyclical ways in order to get this approximate cyclical behavior, modeling sunspots. And so it was a beautiful characterization. He came up with something that's called the autoregressive model, and multivariate counterparts to that still dominate lots of empirical work in macroeconomics. About the same time, Slutsky, who was Russian, thinks about a very similar set of tools, a very similar perspective. There are these random shocks. Slutsky was interested in business cycles and trying to build models of business cycles. So for Slutsky then, he was using the same type of models that Yule was looking, figuring out that if you can think about these random shocks and how they might get transmitted, that can give rise to interesting time series patterns. So these kind of Yule-Slutsky perspectives kind of persist to this day. Slutsky did something that was a little bit, today would be viewed a little bit sloppy. Given he was working out of Russia, it's pretty remarkable on his entire paper. He wanted to do his version of a Monte Carlo study. So he took a bunch of data from a lottery, and he ran this data through his model. And then he had a set of business cycle data, and then he kind of wanted to, and showed that you can kind of match the two paths, roughly speaking, in order to illustrate the success. Of course, the random shocks that hit the lottery are going to be different from the random shocks that hit the underlying economy. So in fact, you couldn't make this lineup work without a little bit of effort. In other words, he had to assimilate a very, very long time series, lifted out a segment that looked a lot like the business cycle data. So it's not the way we like to do business these days, but this is way before there were computers or anything else. So it's a slight cheat to the analysis, but it was just a stunningly beautiful paper for its time. It basically gets translated into English a few years later. Ragnar Fischer was a prominent economist. He was one of the first winners of the Nobel Prize, picked up on the insights of Yule and Slutsky. And he started building models. He started studying the so-called impulse and kind of transmission problem, where there's these random impulses and trying to understand the transmission mechanism by which they influence the economy over time and generating out very interesting dynamic patterns that were underlying stochastic patterns. Okay, so now we got Bachelet building models of financial markets, one of the initiators of so-called Brownian motion, and then Yule and Slutsky feeding into Frisch's work, who's thinking more in terms of macroeconomics. What does all this have to do with each other? So now I ask you to think about the following. Suppose you're an insurance company and you want to insure a bunch of people who are like driving cars and they randomly get into accidents. You've got a big population of people to insure. You could average across that population and by so doing eliminate much of the uncertainty. Right? Now think about a macroeconomic shock, a shock that hits the entire economy. It hits everybody, maybe in different ways, but it kind of hits the population much more generally. You can't average that out. The uncertainty doesn't average out because it's kind of hitting everybody. It's the macroeconomic shocks that require compensation in financial markets. Exposure to shocks that can be averaged out, investors don't have to be compensated for. But macroeconomic shocks, they have to be compensated for. And so much of the theory of financial markets has to do with the compensations for underlying macroeconomic shocks. Of course, eventually the connections get made between this, the work of Frisch and Bachelet and others into a kind of a much richer environment, much richer set of models of the macroeconomy and financial markets. So the question is, what are people inside the model doing? Inside the model, we have investors. We have people trying to decide how much schooling to get. We have people trying to decide whether to engage in new productive enterprises, how much human capital to accumulate, and the like. In order to make smart decisions there, you have to be forward-looking. You have to be making guesses about the future. And so when you build an economic model, you have to ask how those people are making those guesses. There's a really wonderful advance done initiated by Muth, but really developed nicely by Robert Lucas, my colleague at Chicago, in which instead of just making up beliefs of people, we imagine they have long histories of data. And The long histories of data would therefore reveal the underlying model. So in other words, by appealing to long histories of data, the statistical challenges can be removed, and whenever I'm writing down a model, when I solve that model out, I get the predictions of how people are making expectations inside the model. So it gave rise to an equilibrium with expectations being determined inside the model. Prior to this, expectations were some other piece that was just specified in fairly arbitrary ways. And so this was a very convenient and important breakthrough. It also gave a coherent way to do policy analysis. That is, many of us think that when you premise macroeconomic policy on systematically fooling people, it's not a great idea because sooner or later they'll figure stuff out. If you impose rational expectations, you pull off the table this idea of just fooling people repeatedly. It's not possible because you're, by presumption, speculating that they'll figure things out. And it gives rise to a much more robust, the design of much more robust policies. So these are two really wonderful breakthroughs. But if you go back on, this notion that investors inside the model, though, have things all figured out, neglects some components of uncertainty. It features what economists call risk. Risk corresponds to these games of chance. It's like, we know probability. We don't know outcomes, but we know probabilities. We roll the dice. We know there's a 1/6 chance of getting each number. We flip a coin. There's a 50-50 chance of each different outcome. So risk is a situation in which you know probabilities. In effect, what rational expectations did was endow people inside the model with a knowledge of these probabilities. So let me kind of divert to my own perspective on this. I spent the first part of my career building up econometric type methods and applying them under this wonderfully simplifying assumption of rational expectations. Well, what I would find is the models weren't working all that well. Instead of estimating, I was characterizing what was wrong with models. I was characterizing puzzles. Others were as well, in order to try to build better models down the road. I figured, through experience, I was struggling with what, I was engaging in kind of struggles about, which is the correct model and the like. But people inside my models had this all figured out, and that tension, I could be dumb and the people smart. That there's I guess I could assign some weight to that, but I'd also like to think that there's less of a gap between myself and the people inside the models. And maybe there's a problem in imagining that too much had been sorted out. And so this. So let me just think about uncertainty in much more broader terms. So here's uncertainty can be risk. Think about the games of chance. Half the balls are yellow, half the balls are red. There's a 50-50 chance of getting each type of ball. Outcomes are uncertain, but probabilities are known. Risk. Now, suppose you don't know the number of red balls and yellow balls. This is a different type of uncertainty. This is what Bernoulli is really studying. You start drawing balls out of this urn to try to figure out the fraction of yellow balls and red balls. So it's different from the games of chance. Data can be informative, but at the end of the day, without infinite histories of data or infinite sets of data, I'm not going to know precisely the number of yellow balls and red balls. Now let me go one step further, all the way to your right. Imagine you've got a dynamic economy. At any point in time, you don't know the number of yellow balls and red balls, and over time, the number changes on you. So now you're trying to learn about a moving target. It's not just a simple Bernoulli experiment of just drawing randomly out of an urn every period. Now it's the case that the urn itself is changing on you, and you're trying to track this moving target through. You get some information about it, and presuming the target doesn't move dramatically on you over time, then you can kind of learn about things, but you're never going to completely figure stuff out. This is much closer to what we think of the type of uncertainties we have to face in these in the dynamic economies which we like to study. So let me categorize multiple components to uncertainty. Risk. What probabilities does a model assign to events in the future? lot of economic analysis, so what we teach in microtheory is all about risk and risk aversion. It's situations in which we know probabilities but not outcomes. Model ambiguity. We've got different models. We don't know which one's right. How much confidence do we place in each of these models? And how do we use data to try to help us in this task? This is a scope of the field of statistics is largely about this question. The third component. This is the component that, from a modeling perspective, is arguably the most challenging, but at the same time may well be the most important. The models we write down in economics, and this is true in other disciplines, they're simplifications. They're there to provide transparency, to help our understanding of the world, but they're not perfect. They're not going to assign probabilities exactly correctly because when we stare at the models, we know we've left stuff out. It was on purpose to get a tractable model. We had to abstract from stuff. So how do we use models that are not perfect, but yet acknowledge the fact they're not perfect? That's a third source of uncertainty that I think is very important, and it's the one for which the econometric and statistic tools are kind of least well developed for. So in terms of this weighting, this how do we weight models, there was a beautiful contributions made by DiFinetti and Savage. They're the pioneers of Bayesian decision theory. And what Bayesian decision theory was appealed to rational decision making wherever you didn't know probabilities about how to weight across models or the like, through introspection or through other sources, you would form so-called subjective probabilities that would complete the whole probabilistic probability specification, and out would come a rich form of learning. Bayesian statistics and Bayesian econometrics has just had a demonstrably big influence on scientific disciplines, including economics. And Savage, when he was at the University of Chicago, produced this so-called axiomatic system, formally justifying Bayesian decision theory. So why doesn't this just settle things? Maybe maybe by the time Savage did, building on DiFinetti's insights, works out decision theory and Bayesian decision theory, we know how to confront uncertainty. Well, both DiFinetti and Savage, in their own writings, understood and underscored the fact these so-called subjective probabilities could really not be known precisely. That one could maybe speculate on what are reasonable type of ways to weight models or to form these probabilities where you don't have direct evidence, but there may be an element of crudeness to it. So Bayesian decision theory gets us part of the way, but it also doesn't give us direct ways to think about this model misspecification problem either. So it's a very powerful advances, but it doesn't settle everything. So here's a picture, another picture. You can see I like artwork. I could have produced a lot of equations, but I thought artwork was more interesting. This is a painting by Latour. I have a book with Tom Sargent called Robustness, in which we take this painting and the publisher made us lop off one of the key parts of it. My colleague Steven Stigler, again, was only too happy to point out how we destroyed the picture on our book cover, which is kind of true. But I won't take full blame for that. So what's this picture doing? So why do I have this picture? Not surprisingly, this picture is called The Cheat. There's versions of this in 2 museums, and interesting enough, some people even speculate that one of the paintings itself might be fraudulent, but let me not go there for the moment. So let's start off with a person on the right-hand side here, playing cards, apparently thinking that, well, maybe if everyone, roughly speaking, has the same set of skill, that maybe there's kind of maybe roughly 1 in 3 chance of winning the card game. Okay. However, there's this dealer here with some apparently shifty eyes. There's a person pouring wine who looks like she might be participating in some type of fix. And then, of course, the most obvious person engaged in the cheat is the person all the way on the left with cards behind his back. So why am I putting this picture up there? Why are we talking about this? Well, when you think about model misspecification, you don't want to proceed like this guy naively on the right, pretending your model's got everything right. Your simplified model of a fair game and equal chances of winning. You don't want to just take that naive view. You might also want to ask, suppose that view of the world isn't quite correct. What could go wrong? And so you want to envision ways it could go wrong, and then potentially adjust your actions to take those into account. So that's what this is for. So instead of being naive like the person on the right, perhaps we should use our models with a little bit of skepticism. Okay. So how do we push uncertainty? So I've cataloged these different types of uncertainty. How do we push uncertainty to the forefront of economic analysis? There's different ways we do this. One is when we write down models, we increase the exposure to uncertainty. That is, we're more careful about delineating how people inside our models, investors, individual consumers, individuals, are to the type of uncertainties they're exposed to. We also, though, there's been some very important advances in decision theory, in control theory, and engineering and the like about ways to enhance decision-maker concerns about uncertainty. That is, not only do I need to capture how much uncertainty there is in the underlying economic environment, I also have to we have to model how people respond to those types of uncertainty. And as I broaden the notions of uncertainty, then I have to go beyond risk aversion models that are familiar to economists to ones to more general models about how people respond to uncertainty. And then something that's become really prominent recently since the financial crisis is that there's lots of discussion, focus on models that have so-called financial market frictions, on which investors face these frictions, and there's so-called shocks to these frictions, modeled probabilistically. The interplay between these three factors has important consequences, because while we think that the financial market frictions may fluctuate over time, we don't have any good theory for what these shocks exactly might be, and so to presume that we can just simply write down probabilistic specifications for them becomes also challenging. So anyway, the interplay between these three can provide a richness to economic analyses. So I've been doing work recently on placing uncertain investors inside economic models, not just risk-averse investors, uncertain investors. So this involves, when we build the models, we have to depict these economic actors, consumers, enterprises, as they cope with uncertainty when making economic decisions with future consequences. From this, we kind of deduce resulting market responses and consequences for, say, how resources get allocated across the economy. So do we think there's uncertainty? Well, I kind of appeal to authority. I guess the IMF was here recently. So a recent IMF report, The Commodities Roller Coaster, a Fiscal Framework for Uncertain Times. Here's a quote from it. The more recent reversal in commodity prices has driven home the fact that commodity prices are volatile, unpredictable, and subject to long-lasting shocks. In other words, we don't really fully understand the transmission mechanism of shocks to prices, and these prices have big impacts on many economies. Now, the title of this report is really fascinating, A Fiscal Framework for Uncertain Times. It's not quite as ambitious as I might like, but the question is really one of first-order concern. Macroeconomic data. So here's data from, say, the U.S. on real output and from Europe. We see a big drop here at that point in the time of the financial crisis. Of course, there's recessions in the macroeconomy. Here we have a major one. There's been lots of discussion coming out of the recession is how quickly will we recover, and will we ever make it to the so-called original trend line? I don't really believe that trend lines are the right way to model things, but that's how often people talk. And so there's some optimism for the U.S. It's been making some progress. It's been a very slow recovery, stunningly sluggish. In the euro area, given uncertainty with the euro and other forms of uncertainty still to be resolved, and the sluggishness has been that kind of continues. And so, what's the right model of the sluggishness, and when things are going to turn around? Those are important sources of uncertainty, and they matter. If you're trying to figure out what investments to make, part of what you want to be guessing about is how quickly is the economy going to be thriving again in order to make guesses as to what the demand for the goods will be down the road and the like. How about from financial markets? There's a private sector discussions of so-called risk on and risk off. The claim is that investors' appetite for risk rises and falls over time, replacing this by something else, something much broader. And there's no explanation for here. This is largely descriptive. There's academic research. It characterizes time-varying expected returns, and it measures so-called risk-return trade-offs. How do investors trade off expected returns to riskiness? And they show that it fluctuates over time. It's larger in bad times than good times. The risk price, the so-called risk prices, are bigger in magnitude. What explains these movements? I think it's fruitful to go beyond just simple risk stories. By broadening the notion of uncertainty, we can imagine investors who struggle with how to perceive the future in a meaningful way. They really don't know what the right way to think about how quickly the macroeconomy is going to recover. Investors may approach a struggle with differing degrees of confidence. Some people may be completely confident in their views of the world, and others may be more cautious. The impact of this struggle can vary over time as new evidence comes into play and new perspectives emerge. The recent financial crisis is an example of this. It makes us rethink our existing models and perhaps reassign weights across alternative explanations. The outcome of this, once we put these type of concerns inside the economic model, is we get new sources for fluctuations in so-called uncertainty prices. We don't have to impose them from the outside, as is often done. We actually have the model itself start generating endogenous volatility and some richness. Here I've just lifted a picture out of one of my recent papers, trying to just show you a time series of these uncertainty prices. And this is a type of volatility that's being induced endogenously by the model, not being imposed from the outside. And what these are the prices of uncertainty, and they show how they fluctuate. And those who recognize periods of recession and the like will see that these prices get bigger in bad times and good times. Here I put prices of two different shocks because there's two different type of risks, underlying risk in the economy, but investors don't have full confidence in their models of those risks. Let me turn, before closing, into some discussions of economic policy. Interesting story about Hayek. Hayek was a co-winner of the Nobel Prize with Myrdal. Hayek and Myrdal had very little in common, to say the least. It was kind of a very sharp contrast in perspectives. When you receive the Nobel Prize, you're asked to write this essay explaining why you got the Nobel Prize. Of course, nobody really wants to do that because it's too backwards looking. And so Hayek wrote this very interesting Nobel address. He just wins the Nobel Prize in economic sciences, and if you read his address, he's really questioning the extent to which economics is a science. I don't agree with all the arguments made in Hayek's essay. He's deeply skeptical of anyone who's trying to be quantitative with economics, which I'm a big fan of quantitative approaches. But there's this passage in his paper that I think is very important when we think about economic policy and advice. Even if true scientists should recognize the limits of studying human behavior, as long as the public has expectations, there will be people who pretend or believe they can do more to meet popular demand than what is really in their power. If we're going to if we're going to elect politicians who think the only way to communicate with the public is to hire economists that will express their opinions with 100% confidence, we're going to be living dangerously when it comes to designing economic policy, because it's not going to really reflect the knowledge of the economic discipline. And so the demand of public for people who have answers has a danger attached to it. Maybe they aren't real answers. And maybe a more sober and fruitful approach is to acknowledge the limits of our understanding and to design sensible policies that acknowledge those limits. So let's give rise to the following question, which I find truly fascinating. Do complicated problems require complicated solutions? So financial market oversight is arguably a complicated problem. I remember after the financial crisis going to many conferences, and people from the various different research departments of central banks would argue financial market oversight, given its macro consequences, is a complicated problem. And that was absolutely correct. Therefore, it requires a complicated solution. But once we started acknowledging the limits to our understanding, suppose the linkages between financial markets and the macroeconomy, it's not so clear that you want to, instead of just embracing one single model in all of its complexity and designing policies that way, what seems like a more sensible approach is to look across models. Once you start looking across models and then designing policies that kind of perform well across the alternative models, which we think might be possible. So while specific models could imply complex solutions, by the time we start looking across models, we may well be led to much simpler approaches to policymaking, in this case, financial market oversight. If you want to look at a study of complexity, look at financial market oversight and various different rules and the like. I mean, it's definitely evidence of complexity there. I think the Dodd-Frank bill has, in the U.S. for financial market oversight, has, I've forgotten the number of pages, something like 300 to 500, and still leaves a whole bunch of things vague at the end of all that to be worked out in the future. The Basel Accords have some very peculiar and complicated rules inside them that's hard to make full sense out of as well. So I mean, they're all very well intended, but their complexity just jumps in very quickly. Simple rules have the advantage that they avoid adding uncertainty to the economic environment. If we're going to announce very, very complicated policies, you're asking the private sector to respond to them. There's uncertainty about how they will be implemented, and they also open the door to regulatory discretion hidden between the complexity. So I think there's fascinating links between the complexity of the underlying environment and the corresponding uncertainty. You want another complicated problem? How about uncertainty and climate change? We have lots of evidence of human influence in the climate. Once we turn it into quantitative statements and the magnitude of that and the timing of those impacts, uncertainty shows up. There's this there was this very nice article in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed written by Stephen Koonin. And if you Google this article, you'll see lots of climate scientists being very upset with it. But they're not upset about this passage. They claim that he was too casual with some evidence. And I'm not going to comment on that. But I think this statement is very important. Any serious discussion of the changing climate must acknowledge not only scientific certainties, but also uncertainties, especially in projecting the future. Recognizing those limits rather than ignoring them will lead to a more sober and ultimately productive discussion of climate change and climate policies. I think many scientists are afraid if they go out front about the scientific uncertainties, it'll lead the public to not want to do anything. But the fact that once we acknowledge uncertainties, doing simple things is different than doing nothing. Of course, simple things can be bad simple things. You want good ones, but the mere fact that you acknowledge these uncertainties doesn't mean that you don't act, but maybe you act differently, and in ways that are more sensible. So I could go on to other type of policy. We could have a discussion about monetary policy, fiscal policy, and the like, and very similar with a very similar theme. But instead of doing that, let me just give a summary of this talk, and then one final comment. There's two perspectives of uncertainty that are important to economists. This is why mathematical builders of economics are not like physicists. Many people say that economists are trying to be physicists. Well, physicists don't have uncertainty inside their models. They don't have to cope with investors forward-looking, making guesses about the future. Their particles behave in somewhat different ways, in ways that are, so we have these two perspectives. There's the outside the model perspective that we learn in statistics and a lot of econometrics classes, but there's also inside the model uncertainty. How do we imagine people inside our model are coping with uncertainty? I think it's valuable to broaden the notion of uncertainty, and I find it useful to distinguish these three components. Risk. What probabilities does a model assign to events? Ambiguity. How much confidence do we place in each different model or view of the world? And finally, misspecification. How do we use models that are not perfect? Finally, given the limits to our understanding, it may not be that complicated problems are best addressed with complicated solutions, but rather may well be better addressed with simple ones. So, ending, instead of me offering you my insight, I'm going to appeal to a famous American author, Mark Twain. Education is the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much all for your attendance. We invite you all to the main hall for a cocktail in honor of Professor Hansen. Good evening.